Hello, boys and girls. Welcome back to Mr. Herring's fifth grade social studies class. Um, Today is Thursday, April 18th, 2024, and we will be learning about the Great Depression. The Great Depression is a time period in our country that follows the Roaring Twenties, which was arguably the most prosperous time in our nation's history. And following the Great Roaring Twenties, we get the Great Depression, which is a really terrible time in our nation's history. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to jump right in. The Great Depression lasts from 1929 to 1940. It ends right about the beginning of World War II. The Great Depression begins in 1929 on a day called Black Tuesday. We'll talk about that in just a moment. The decade of the 1920s had begun optimistically. Medical advances had reduced deaths. The life expectancy had grown by more than 10 years. The return of peace allowed people to focus on themselves. Cars allowed people greater mobility, and the economy was booming. However, the decade that had begun so promisingly ended in absolute disaster. The Great Depression was the single worst economic catastrophe in our nation's history. So we're going to talk about the causes of the Great Depression, and there are six big causes, are the main causes of the Great Depression. First, we have the overproduction. In the 1920s, which was the most prosperous time in our nation's history, we saw the introduction of new products such as cars, radios, refrigerators, and other appliances. Companies were soon producing more goods than people could actually afford to buy. And what I mean by that is refrigerator companies were just making too many refrigerators and they weren't being sold. Cars, the Model A Ford by Henry Ford was mass produced and he put it in every home, but he kept making them and eventually they just had an overproduction of everything. And so we couldn't put them in any more homes and people couldn't afford them anymore. The next cause is the uneven distribution of income. Now, this is a tricky one here. Farmers, African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans faced hard times in the 1920s. The white Americans were doing much better. They had this strong improvement of their wealth. But the other groups, especially the African Americans and the farmers, were really hit hard during this time period. And if you know anything about agriculture, when the farmers are hit hard and they can't produce their farming products, the nation is going to suffer, and that's exactly what happens. Third, the stock market frenzy. So people are buying stocks left and right. They're hoping to get rich. There's this kind of a scheme out there, the new trend of buying stocks. And if you buy stocks, then your stocks are going to go up and you're going to make a fortune on them. Unfortunately, that just doesn't happen. It's really a big scheme for a lot of people. They invest everything they have, they put everything into their stock market stocks. And of course, they never get rich. And this drives the stock prices even higher. And people also bought stocks on margin, which means they pay a small part now and they try to pay the rest later. But unfortunately, what happens is I buy all my stocks now, but I go broke and I never am able to pay for the rest. So that decreases the value of those stocks in the later days. But what you need to know is there was just a huge stock market frenzy where everyone is just flooding the stock market with everything they have and they really can't afford to do it. The fourth reason is real estate. People invested in real estate with hopes to get rich quick. Um, you're buying up and as many properties as you can. Unfortunately, no one is interested in those properties that they're buying, and so they never really resell for a profit, which is unfortunate. They try really hard to sell that property, but it just never does come to fruition. The fifth reason is the shaky banking and debt. Now, this is a tricky one. I'm going to stay on topic here. Bankers often invested their depositors' money in a very unsound investment. So when you use a bank, your money doesn't really stay in the bank. The bank uses that money to make investments. They also are investing in the stock market. So when they use your money to invest in the stock market and the stocks that they buy lose their value, what happens to your money? It goes away, it loses its value. So a lot of banks are doing this, and it's really a bad practice. The government tries to come in and regulate the banking system eventually, but before they do that, there is no hold on it. It just happens every day. It's common practice. And this causes a lot of problems for people who invest and have their money in banks. And then finally, we get all of these things lead to consumer debt. Many consumers bought more on credit than they could actually afford. They lived well beyond their means. They lived well beyond their paycheck, and they never could catch up on their credit cards. And so the credit card companies aren't getting their money back, and so they go under too. There's an overextension of this economy where people are using credit, and when you use credit and you're not paying things off, it causes a lot of problems. Okay, so let's talk about the stock market. The stock market crashes in 1929. It's Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. Everybody tries to sell all of their stocks. And when that happens, stock prices plummet and the stock market just can no longer support itself. And that's exactly what happens on Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. The stock market completely and utterly crashes. All right, remember, you can always pause the video if you need to take a moment to fill in your answers. October 29th, 1929, prices on New York Stock Exchange plunged. They plummeted to near zero. As prices fell, people tried desperately to sell off their stocks. That makes sense. If you're not making any money on it, you want to try to sell your holdings. And that causes the prices to fall even more. People weren't able to repay their loans or their rents, and this led to bank failures or bankruptcy, and that wiped out people's life savings. The demands for goods decreased because people had no money to buy anything. So all those refrigerators that were built and all the cars that were built and all the radios that were built, nobody had money to buy them. So the companies themselves also actually had trouble and some went under. And of course, when that happens, the factories close. And when those refrigerator company factories close, people lose their jobs. And it's a vicious cycle. And all of this is a direct result of the events that happened on October 29th, 1929, when the stock market collapses. And then in 1936, to make things even worse, as we're going through this Great Depression, we have an incredible climate issue or an environmental issue. We get this thing called the Dust Bowl of 1936. It happens in the Great Plains, right in the middle of the United States. Because farmers are overusing their soil, the soil loses its nutrients, and there isn't a lot of rain falling, so that dries the land up. And when the land gets really, really dry and there's a huge drought, there's no rain falling, the land gets even more dry. And then with the heating and cooling of the Earth's atmosphere, that causes winds. Well, that's a bad combination. High winds and dry land causes huge dust storms. And these dust storms cause lots of problems for our country. It caused very poor agricultural production. If you have a dust storm and your crops can't grow, you can't sell your crops and you can't make any money. And I've got some really good pictures to show you about this dust bowl. Here's a perfect picture. The dust was so strong that it buried people's cars and wagons and even parts of their houses. This is probably 4 to 5 feet of sand from this dust bowl that just covers everything. Here's another example of a dust storm. Now, when you watch movies, you hear about really bad dust storms in the Middle East, but we had these in 1936 right here in the Great Plains of the United States. Incredibly high, hundreds of feet tall dust storms. Here's another example of a dust storm leaving its dust behind. It buries a house halfway up the house. Kind of unfortunate. And the next thing we're going to talk about is something called the Hoovervilles. Now, President Hoover was in office during the collapse, during the Great Depression, and it's really unfortunate. He gets a bad rap, and he probably wasn't the best man for the job. He wasn't prepared to take over the country in such an economic crisis that we suffered, but it wasn't really his fault. However, when things go really, really bad and people are losing their homes, they start living in these little shanties, these little sheds, so to speak, and these groups of sheds that collect in certain areas become known as Hoovervilles. named after President Hoover. You'd get multiple people living in one of these little shacks, and they even had them right outside the White House. They pop up all over the country. Here's an example of a Hooverville. Some actually had water pans outside where someone would have to go and track down a bucket of water, bring it back to the house, pour it in a sink so you could wash your face. It wasn't very easy to bathe. You did the best you could, but it was very difficult times. But Hooverville is another example. They weren't all nice boarded buildings. They were pieces of cloth held up by some sticks and some string to keep from blowing over. And people lived inside these. You see the woman with a little baby and two other children. Her husband is probably out looking for work or panhandling for work to try to make a little bit of money to buy some food for the family. Here's another close-up picture of Hooverville. I'm not sure where this one is located exactly, but Hoovervilles were kind of migrant. You think about the old Native American teepees. A lot of the Hoovervilles could be the houses, the little tents could be taken down, and the people would migrate from town to town. And a lot of them would have to migrate from town to town using the trains. They didn't buy a ticket; they just hopped on a empty train car, and they would go from town to town. And they had a really cool system set up to know if the town was good for the people who were homeless and needed work. And here's a really good chart to explain this. So, if you were a migrant living in Hooverville and you're traveling from town to town, you would get off at little stations, and there'd be little groups of people set up along the railroad, and there'd be signs or markings on trees. And if you saw some of these markings, it told you what you might find in this little area. For example, this one here in the front, there's a kind-hearted lady. They might put this on a tree outside of her house, or this little symbol here, a kind woman. This one, food for work here. If you see this symbol, it told you if you might be able to do some work for these people, and they might give you some food. If you saw these two signs, the shovels, that means work available here. Um, this one's kind of interesting. Fake illness here. They would lie about everybody being sick in this home, or this area. You might want to go there. Um, this one, little happy face. If you come here, you can sleep in a barn. They might let you, sleep there for a while. This one down here, like a ruler. I'm not sure what this is about, but it says bad dog. You may not want to stay there. But they set up these communication systems to communicate with each other, to help each other out, let each other know, what was available in this town or this area. It was pretty good stuff. Something that did come from this area, you get a condition because of the lack of nutrients that the women were getting when they became pregnant. It caused a nasty disease and a nasty condition called the rickets. And so the babies would be born and they weren't getting enough nutrition, so they wouldn't grow naturally like they should. Really, really sad. They were malnutritioned, malnourished, and they just didn't grow. They have these children, might be 2 years old, where they should be much bigger and much more developed, and they weren't because of the malnutrition. They were suffering either in the womb or even outside. They didn't have enough food to really get everything they needed, and those are called the rickets. But from the Great Depression, we get a president. Mr. Franklin Delano Roosevelt takes office, and when he comes into office, he sets a goal for himself. His goal and his mission after replacing Hoover is to fix America. And he comes up with something called the New Deal. Now, the New Deal is a relief, recovery, and reform idea. His plan is to give relief where needed, recover when we can, and reform the problems to make them better. Some of the things that come out of the New Deal, we get the Civil Conservation Corps. And what this did was, if you were unemployed looking for work, he would gather you up and you pay young men to plant trees and clean up forests and parks. Um, just go out and pick up trash, anything to justify getting a paycheck. He developed the National Recovery Act, which is a minimum wage, which means when you took a job, you had to be paid a minimum wage. You could not be paid less than that minimum wage. Something really big that helped all of our farmers in agriculture, he establishes the Adjustment Act. I apologize. The Agricultural Adjustment Act. And what this does, it helps farmers. He creates a lot of things. He actually, to balance the market for vegetables, he would actually pay farmers to harvest their crop and then destroy it so that there was just enough in the economy to sell. There was not an overabundance of something to sell. He also creates the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to insure banks. He gets rid of all those corrupt policies and practices of using your money to invest in bad investments. He gets the Social Security Act, which is a family insurance and old age pension. Unemployment, disabled, or retired people would benefit from these things. And then finally, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built dams to create hydroelectric power, trying to give power to all these cities that were struggling. And that's really all there is to the Great Depression. Once President Roosevelt comes into office, things get really better. I'm not going to say we ever really get back to the roaring 20s, but things get increasingly better. And a lot of it was supposed to be temporary until America got back on its feet. Unfortunately, many of those things ended up being permanent, which is just the way it is. But at the end of World War II, the United States is in a much, much better place. And then we get some new problems that we'll talk about later. So once you have your notes done, I hope you enjoyed the lesson, as brief as it was. I hope you have a great afternoon, and we will catch you guys next time. Have a great day.